On the morning of May 8, 1942, at 10,000 feet above the Coral Sea, Lieutenant Stanley Veitasa banked his SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber through scattered clouds, scanning the horizon for Japanese torpedo planes. At 28 years old, the pilot they called Swede was flying anti-torpedo patrol from the carrier Yorktown, expecting a routine morning of hunting slow, lumbering bombers. His Douglas SBD-3 was built for diving on ships, not dogfighting, 250 miles per hour maximum speed, heavy as a truck, with the agility of a flying anvil. The Japanese called it the slow death, because American dive bombers were such easy targets for their nimble Zero fighters. Those Zeros could hit 350 miles per hour and turn on a dime, making them the terror of the Pacific. Every American pilot knew the math. If you're flying a bomber and you meet a Zero, you run or you die. Veitasa had been briefed on the enemy's capabilities just hours earlier. Japanese strike formations were inbound, escorted by the best fighter pilots in the world, men who had been killing Allied airmen since Pearl Harbor. The conventional wisdom was carved in stone. Dive bombers avoid fighters, period. They're too slow, too heavy, too helpless. When the radio crackled with contact reports and Veitasa spotted the distinctive silhouettes of 6 Mitsubishi Zeros diving toward his formation, every manual, every training exercise, every survival instinct screamed the same command: turn away, dive for the deck, get out of there. The Japanese pilots saw what they expected: clumsy American bombers, ripe for slaughter, probably already breaking formation in panic. What happened next would prove that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes the easy target has other plans. But in that crystalline moment above the Coral Sea, as 6 of Japan's deadliest fighters screamed down at nearly 400 miles per hour, Stanley Veitasa made a decision that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The Pacific dawn stretched endlessly in all directions as Task Force 17 carved through the Coral Sea, 200 miles east of New Guinea. The carrier Yorktown rode the swells at the center of the formation, her flight deck bustling with pre-dawn preparations. In the ready room of Scouting Squadron 5, Lieutenant Stanley Veitasa studied the morning briefing board while sipping coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since Pearl Harbor. The intelligence was clear. Japanese carriers were operating somewhere to the northwest, and enemy strike formations would likely appear before noon. Veitasa had been flying the Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless for 8 months, long enough to know its strengths and limitations intimately. The aircraft was a workhorse, solid, reliable, and deadly accurate in a dive. But it was no fighter. At 250 miles per hour maximum speed, the SBD was nearly 100 miles per hour slower than the Japanese. Zero. Its turning radius was wider, its climb rate inferior, and its primary armament consisted of just 2 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the engine cowling. The plane had been designed for one mission: diving on enemy ships from high altitude and putting bombs exactly where they needed to go. The morning patrol assignment was routine anti-torpedo plane coverage. Intelligence suggested the Japanese would launch torpedo bombers and dive bombers escorted by fighters, and the SBDs would patrol at medium altitude to intercept the slower attack aircraft before they could reach the task force. It was a logical use of resources. The fast Wildcat fighters would handle the Zeros while the dive bombers hunted the more vulnerable attack planes. At 0830, Veitasa climbed into the cockpit of his SBD-3, running through the familiar pre-flight ritual. Behind him, aviation radio man second class John Liska settled into the rear gunner's position, checking his twin 30 caliber machine guns. The Dauntless felt heavy beneath them, loaded with ammunition and fuel for an extended patrol. As the deck crew signaled all clear, Veitasa advanced the throttles and felt the Wright Cyclone engine's 950 horsepower pull them into the morning sky. The patrol sector lay 40 miles northwest of the task force, where intelligence predicted the Japanese strike would approach. Veitasa climbed to 10,000 feet, settling into a steady cruise that would conserve fuel while providing good visibility. The morning was crystal clear, with unlimited visibility in all directions. Below, the Coral Sea stretched like hammered steel, broken only by occasional whitecaps. At this altitude, the SBD's cockpit offered an excellent view forward into both sides, though the rear gunner had to watch their 6 o'clock position. For the first hour, the patrol proceeded without incident. Veitasa flew lazy figure eights through his assigned sector, occasionally checking in with other aircraft on the radio. The routine was almost hypnotic. Scan the horizon, check instruments, adjust course, scan again. But beneath the surface calm, tension was building. Every pilot knew that somewhere out there, Japanese carriers were launching their own aircraft, and the two forces were on a collision course that would determine the fate of the entire South Pacific campaign. At 0945, the radio crackled with the first contact report. A scout plane had spotted enemy aircraft 90 miles northwest, bearing down on the task force. The formation included dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, exactly what intelligence had predicted. Veritasa felt his pulse quicken as he banked toward the reported bearing, straining his eyes against the morning glare. The first visual contact came 12 minutes later. Small dots appeared on the horizon, growing larger as the two formations converged. Veritasa could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese aircraft, the angular wings of Aichi dive bombers, the torpedo-laden Nakajima attack planes, and most ominously, the sleek profiles of Mitsubishi Zeros providing escort. The enemy formation was flying in a disciplined pattern, with the fighters weaving above and around the slower attack aircraft. According to doctrine, this was the moment when the SBD pilots should have positioned themselves to attack the bombers while avoiding the fighters at all costs. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by some of the most experienced pilots in the world. Japanese naval aviation had been honed by years of combat over China, and their pilots averaged over 800 hours of flight time before reaching the carriers. By contrast, many American pilots had barely 300 hours when they entered combat. But as Veritasa watched the enemy formation approach, he realized the tactical situation was more complex than the briefing had suggested. The Japanese fighters were not maintaining a tight defensive screen around their bombers. Instead, they were ranging wide, apparently confident that any American aircraft they encountered would be easy prey. This overconfidence, born from months of seemingly effortless victories across the Pacific, created an opportunity that trained eyes could exploit. The engagement began when 6 Zeros detached from the main formation and dove toward Veritasa's section. The Japanese pilots had spotted the lone SBD and apparently decided to eliminate what they assumed would be a helpless target before continuing to the carriers. Their attack was textbook, a high-speed diving approach that would bring them into firing position with overwhelming speed and energy advantage. Every instinct, every hour of training, every survival briefing screamed the same message: turn away, dive for the deck, use the SBD's superior diving speed to escape. The Dauntless could outdive almost any fighter, and the smart play was to live to fight another day. But as the Zeros closed the distance, Veritasa made a decision that contradicted everything he had been taught about air combat. Instead of turning away, he banked toward the attackers, accepting battle on terms that should have guaranteed his destruction. The moment crystallized everything that was wrong with conventional thinking about aerial warfare. The Japanese had built their entire tactical doctrine around the assumption that enemy aircraft would behave predictably. Fighters would fight, bombers would run. They had not prepared for a bomber pilot who refused to play by the rules, who understood that his aircraft's limitations could be turned into advantages under the right circumstances. As the Zeros committed to their attack run, Veritasa's decision to turn and fight transformed what should have been a routine kill into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The 6 Zeros came down like hawks, their sleek fuselages glinting in the morning sun as they accelerated past 300 miles per hour in their diving attack. Flight Petty Officer Kenji Okabe led the formation, confident that the lone American dive bomber would either flee or die within the next 30 seconds. Japanese pilots had been killing SBDs across the Pacific for months, and this engagement promised to be no different from dozens of others. The slow, heavy American aircraft had nowhere to run and no chance to fight. Veritasa felt the familiar weight of the Dauntless as he hauled back on the stick, pulling the nose up toward the diving Zeros. The right Cyclone engine roared at full power, but the SBD's climb rate was painfully slow compared to the plunging fighters. Behind him, aviation radio man Liska swiveled his twin .30 calibers toward the approaching threat, though the rear guns would be useless until the Zeros committed to a firing pass from behind. Everything depended on what happened in the next few seconds. The Japanese formation split as they closed the distance, with 3 Zeros angling for a head-on pass, while the others maneuvered for follow-up attacks from the flanks. This was standard Zero tactics, overwhelming firepower from multiple angles, using superior speed to dictate the terms of engagement. Okabe's aircraft carried 2 20mm cannons in the wings, plus 2 7.7mm machine guns in the engine cowling, giving him devastating close-range punch. The other Zeros were similarly armed, creating a crossfire that should have torn the Dauntless apart. But Veitasa had spent months studying every intelligence report about Zero capabilities, and he understood something the Japanese pilots had overlooked. The Mitsubishi fighter's incredible agility came at a price. The aircraft was lightly built, with minimal armor protection and fuel tanks that could explode if hit by incendiary rounds. The Zero's 20mm cannons were deadly accurate but carried limited ammunition, just 60 rounds per gun. Most critically, the fighter's exceptional performance was optimized for high-speed maneuvering, not the tight, slow-speed turning fights that could develop at lower altitudes. The head-on pass developed with stunning speed. Okabe's Zero approached at nearly 400 miles per hour, while the SBD climbed toward him at less than 200, creating a closing rate that left both pilots only seconds to aim and fire. Veitasa waited until the Zero's wing guns began twinkling with muzzle flashes before pressing his own triggers, sending streams of 50 caliber rounds toward the oncoming fighter. The heavy bullets reached out across the narrowing gap, each round carrying nearly 3 times the kinetic energy of the Zero's rifle caliber machine guns. The Japanese pilot's shots went wide, his aim disrupted by the unexpected sight of an American bomber coming straight at him instead of turning away. Okabe had fired too early, expecting the SBD to break off and present a predictable target. Instead, he found himself in a deadly game of chicken with a pilot who refused to flinch. Veitasa's 50 caliber round stitched across the Zero's port wing, punching through the light aluminum structure and severing control cables. Okabe's aircraft shuddered and rolled inverted as he flashed past the Dauntless, his port aileron trailing fragments of torn metal. The damaged Zero entered a spiraling dive, smoke beginning to stream from punctured fuel lines in the wing. Within seconds, the smoke became flame as aviation gasoline ignited, turning the graceful fighter into a falling torch. Okabe had perhaps 10 seconds to contemplate his miscalculation before the Zero exploded against the surface of the Coral Sea. The remaining Zeros scattered momentarily, their formation disrupted by the shocking sight of their leader's aircraft burning toward the water. Japanese naval aviation doctrine had not prepared them for dive bombers that fought back effectively, and the tactical situation had suddenly become far more complex than anticipated. The Americans were supposed to run, not turn aggressive and start shooting down fighters with lucky bursts. But Veitasa was far from finished. As the second Zero pilot, Flight Petty Officer Yamamoto, pulled up from his diving attack and attempted to come around for another pass, the SBD pilot demonstrated the tactical insight that would make him legendary. Instead of trying to outrun or outclimb the faster fighter, he used the Dauntless's superior low-speed handling and structural strength to force the engagement into a tight turning circle where speed mattered less than pilot skill and aircraft durability. The SBD could maintain controlled flight at airspeeds that would stall most fighters, and its robust construction allowed aggressive maneuvering that would tear the wings off lighter aircraft. Veitasa pulled the dive bomber into a climbing spiral turn, forcing Yamamoto to either break off the attack or accept a slow-speed maneuvering fight where his advantages disappeared. The Zero pilot, trained to exploit speed and altitude, found himself dragged into exactly the type of engagement his aircraft was not designed to win. Yamamoto made the fatal mistake of following the SBD into the climbing turn, confident that his superior maneuverability would allow him to bring his guns to bear. But the tight radius forced him to reduce power and extend flaps to maintain lift, slowing the Zero to barely 200 miles per hour. At that speed, the fighter's controls became mushy and unpredictable, while the Dauntless remained solid and responsive. Veitasa used his intimate knowledge of the SBD's flight characteristics to maintain position on the inside of the turn, gradually working his nose around until the Zero appeared in his gun sight. The second burst of 50 caliber fire was more deliberate than the first, carefully aimed center mass as the two aircraft circled each other like aerial predators. The heavy rounds slammed into the Zero's engine compartment, shattering the sockeye radial and severing oil lines. Yamamoto's propeller windmilled to a stop as black smoke poured from the cowling, and the fighter began losing altitude in a powerless glide toward the ocean below. The third Zero pilot broke off his attack run entirely, apparently deciding that engaging a dive bomber willing to fight was not worth the risk. This represented a complete reversal of tactical expectations, Japanese fighters retreating from American bombers rather than hunting them down like sitting ducks. The psychological impact was as significant as the material damage, proving that aggressive tactics and superior gunnery could overcome seemingly hopeless odds. As the surviving Zeros regrouped at a respectful distance, Veitasa surveyed the tactical situation with grim satisfaction. 2 enemy fighters had been destroyed in less than 3 minutes, and the remainder were showing newfound respect for what they had assumed would be easy prey. The engagement had demonstrated that American aircraft and pilots could not only survive but prevail when conventional wisdom was abandoned in favor of aggressive innovation. The remaining 4 Zeros circled warily at a distance of nearly 2 miles, their pilots reassessing what had begun as a routine interception. Flight Petty Officer Tanaka, now the senior pilot after Okabe's death, radioed his wingmen with new instructions. The American bomber had proven far more dangerous than expected, but 4 fighters against 1 should still guarantee victory. The key was patience. Force the SBD to burn fuel in defensive maneuvers until its options were exhausted. Veitasa understood the tactical shift immediately. The Japanese pilots were no longer treating him as easy prey, which meant they would be more cautious and methodical in their attacks. His fuel gauge showed he had burned through nearly a quarter of his load in the violent maneuvering, and extended combat would leave him with barely enough range to return to Yorktown. Behind him, Liska reported damage to the port wing where 20mm shells had punched through the aluminum skin, though the structure remained sound. The next attack came from an unexpected angle. Instead of diving from altitude, one of the Zeros approached from below, climbing steeply to engage the SBD from beneath, where the rear gunner's field of fire was blocked by the aircraft's own fuselage. It was a clever tactic that exploited the Dauntless's blind spot, and Tanaka had clearly learned from watching his squadron mates die. The Zero's climb rate was superior to the SBD's, meaning the Japanese pilot could dictate the geometry of the engagement, but Veitasa had been anticipating exactly this maneuver. Instead of maintaining level flight and allowing the Zero to climb into firing position, he pushed the nose down and extended the SBD's perforated dive brakes. The sudden deceleration caught the climbing Zero pilot completely off guard. His aircraft shot past the now slower Dauntless, overshooting into perfect position for a deflection shot. Veitasa's 50 caliber guns hammered out another burst, the heavy rounds tearing through the Zero's starboard wing and puncturing the fuel tank. The wounded fighter rolled away trailing white vapor that quickly turned to orange flame. The pilot, Petty Officer Sato, had perhaps 15 seconds before the fire reached critical fuel lines. He rolled the Zero inverted and pulled the canopy release. But the aircraft was too low for a successful bailout. The fighter hit the water in a spreading pool of burning gasoline, taking Japan's third pilot of the engagement down with it. Tanaka's remaining wingmen were now visibly reluctant to press home their attacks. The tactical situation had devolved into something unprecedented. A single American dive bomber had shot down 3 of Japan's premier fighters in less than 5 minutes. This was supposed to be impossible according to every combat manual and training scenario. Zeros dominated the Pacific skies precisely because they could outfly and outfight any Allied aircraft. Yet here was a clumsy bomber systematically destroying them. The fourth engagement began when Tanaka himself committed to a high-speed slashing attack from the starboard quarter, hoping to use pure velocity to overcome the SBD's defensive advantages. His Zero accelerated past 350 miles per hour in a shallow dive, wing guns already chattering as he closed to effective range. This was the classic Zero tactic that had decimated Allied air forces from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, overwhelming speed and firepower applied with surgical precision. Veitasa waited until the last possible moment before hauling the SBD into a steep climbing turn that brought the aircraft to the very edge of a stall. The Dauntless shuddered and bucked as airflow separated from the wings, but the robust design held together under stresses that would have broken a lighter fighter. Tanaka's Zero, committed to its high-speed pass, could not match the turn without risking structural failure. The Japanese pilot's shots went wide as his target disappeared from his gun sight picture. As Tanaka flashed past and began climbing for another attack, Veitasa demonstrated the most audacious tactic of the entire engagement. He rolled the SBD inverted and pulled through into a split S maneuver, diving after the climbing Zero with all the energy he could muster. The pursuing dive bomber achieved nearly 300 miles per hour in the descent, closing rapidly on the surprised Japanese fighter. Tanaka found himself in the unprecedented position of being chased by an aircraft he had been sent to destroy. The role reversal was complete when Veitasa opened fire from directly behind the Zero at a range of less than 100 yards. His 50 caliber rounds walked up the fighter's fuselage from tail to cockpit, shattering the canopy and killing Tanaka instantly. The Zero continued flying for several seconds under the dead pilot's hands before gradually nosing over into a final dive. It struck the ocean with barely a splash, taking with it the last aggressive fighter pilot of the original formation. The fifth Zero, flown by the youngest and least experienced pilot in the group, had watched 4 squadron mates die in rapid succession. Petty Officer Nakamura had less than 200 hours in the Zero and had never encountered an enemy aircraft that fought back with such devastating effectiveness. His training had emphasized the invincibility of Japanese naval aviation, but the evidence of his own eyes contradicted everything he had been taught. The American bomber was still flying, still fighting, and still killing his comrades with methodical precision. Nakamura's final attack was half-hearted and poorly coordinated, more an attempt to salvage honor than achieve victory. He approached from dead ahead in a head-on pass that offered both pilots equal opportunity to score hits, but his nerve broke at the last second. Instead of maintaining course and trading fire, he pulled up and away, exposing his aircraft's vulnerable underside to Vegetasa's guns. The sixth and final burst of 50 caliber fire was almost perfunctory. Nakamura's Zero disintegrated in mid-air as the heavy rounds found the main fuel tank and detonated the remaining aviation gasoline in a spectacular fireball. Pieces of the shattered fighter rained down across a quarter-mile radius of ocean, leaving only an expanding oil slick to mark where Japan's last pilot had died. The engagement was over in less than 8 minutes from first contact to final kill. 6 Japanese fighters had attacked what they assumed was a helpless American bomber, and all 6 had been destroyed by a pilot flying an aircraft supposedly incapable of air-to-air combat. The tactical implications were staggering. If a single SBD could annihilate an entire Zero formation, what did that mean for Japanese air superiority across the Pacific? Vegetasa surveyed the empty sky with grim satisfaction, noting multiple holes in his wings and fuselage where enemy rounds had found their mark. His fuel was running critically low, and the return flight to Yorktown would test both his navigation skills and the SBD's remaining mechanical reliability. But he had proven something that would echo through the halls of naval aviation for decades to come: that superior tactics and aggressive piloting could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions as Vegetasa banked the damaged SBD toward home, black smoke from burning Japanese aircraft still visible on the horizon behind him. Task Force 17 was under attack from multiple directions, and the reports flooding the airwaves painted a picture of coordinated chaos. Japanese dive bombers had penetrated the combat air patrol and were beginning their attack runs on the carriers. Torpedo planes were approaching from the northwest in a classic anvil formation designed to split the task force's defensive fire. The very enemy aircraft Vegetasa had been sent to intercept were now boring in on Yorktown and Lexington, while he flew home with empty guns and a fuel gauge hovering near critical. Lieutenant Commander Bill Birch's voice cut through the radio chatter, calling for all available SBDs to reform and prepare for defensive action around the task force. But Vegetasa's aircraft was in no condition for further combat. Hydraulic fluid from damaged lines had coated the cockpit floor. The port aileron responded sluggishly to control inputs, and multiple holes in the fuselage created a whistling symphony that spoke of structural damage throughout the airframe. Behind him, aviation radio man Liska reported that his rear guns had jammed after firing less than 50 rounds, leaving them defenseless against any pursuit. The flight back to the task force took on an increasingly desperate quality as radio reports detailed the developing attack. Japanese Aichi dive bombers were screaming down on Yorktown from 15,000 feet, their fixed landing gear and distinctive gull wings clearly visible to observers on the carrier's bridge. The ship's anti-aircraft guns had opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding ordnance, but the enemy pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. These were veteran air crews from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, men who had perfected their technique over targets from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. At 11:18, a 250-kilogram bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck just aft of the island superstructure, penetrating through multiple decks before detonating in a magazine space. The explosion killed or wounded 66 men instantly and started fires that threatened the carrier's aviation fuel storage. Smoke poured from the wounded ship as damage control parties rushed to contain the blaze, but secondary explosions continued to rock the vessel as aviation ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. Vegetasa could see the smoke column from 30 miles away, the black pillar rising into the morning sky like a funeral pyre for American naval aviation. His radio was filled with damage reports and casualty updates that painted an increasingly grim picture of the task force's condition. Yorktown was listing to starboard and losing speed as flooded compartments dragged at her hull. Lexington had been hit by 2 torpedoes on the port side and was taking on thousands of tons of seawater, despite her crew's frantic efforts to maintain watertight integrity. The tactical situation that had seemed so promising just minutes earlier now appeared catastrophic. Veitasa's destruction of 6 Japanese fighters had been tactically brilliant, but strategically insignificant. While he had been proving that American pilots could outfight their supposedly superior opponents, the real battle had been decided by the bombers and torpedo planes he had been sent to intercept. The enemy strike had achieved its primary objective, crippling both American carriers and potentially ending the United States Navy's ability to project power across the Central Pacific. As he approached the task force perimeter, Veitasa could see the full extent of the disaster unfolding before him. Yorktown was dead in the water, her flight deck buckled and torn by the bomb impact. Fires burned uncontrolled in multiple sections of the ship, and her crew was abandoning damaged areas to prevent the flames from reaching critical ammunition storage. The carrier's island structure was blackened with soot, and her radar arrays had been destroyed by blast damage, leaving the task force partially blind to further air attacks. Lexington's condition was even worse. The torpedo hits had opened massive holes in her port side below the waterline, and she was listing heavily despite counter-flooding efforts. Aviation gasoline vapor had accumulated in her lower decks, creating an explosive atmosphere that could detonate at any moment. Her crew worked desperately to maintain electrical power and keep her aircraft elevators functioning, but the ship was clearly dying beneath their feet. The landing signal officer on Yorktown waved Veitasa off on his first approach, indicating that the flight deck was too damaged to accept recovering aircraft. The bomb hit had left a crater nearly 20 feet across, and twisted steel plates made normal carrier operations impossible. Emergency repairs were underway, but it would be hours before the deck could handle anything heavier than emergency landings. With his fuel critically low, Veitasa had no choice but to attempt an approach despite the hazardous conditions. His second approach was a masterpiece of precision, flying under nearly impossible circumstances. The SBD touched down just short of the bomb crater and caught the number 3 arresting wire with barely 10 feet to spare. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, deck crews swarmed around the bullet-riddled Dauntless, marveling at the damage it had sustained while somehow continuing to fly. 23 holes were counted in the wings and fuselage, including several that had passed within inches of critical control cables. As Veitasa climbed out of the cockpit, the full weight of the tactical situation crashed down on him. His individual victory over the Japanese fighters seemed hollow in light of the disaster that had befallen the task force. Yorktown was burning, Lexington was sinking, and hundreds of American sailors were dead or wounded. The very carriers that had given him the platform to prove his point about aggressive tactics were now crippled or destroyed, potentially ending any hope of continuing offensive operations in the Pacific. The celebration that should have followed his unprecedented achievement was muted by the reality of strategic defeat. Fellow pilots gathered around to hear his account of the engagement, but their questions were subdued by the smoke and flames that continued to pour from both carriers. The tactical lessons of his fight with the Zeros would have to wait. Survival had become the immediate priority for every man in Task Force 17. Within hours, the extent of the damage became clear. Lexington would have to be abandoned and scuttled to prevent her capture by Japanese forces. Yorktown might be saved, but she would require months of repairs before returning to action. The 2-carrier task force that had entered the Coral Sea with such confidence was now reduced to a single damaged ship limping toward port. Veitasa's personal triumph had occurred against the backdrop of one of the most costly defeats in American naval history. The weeks following the Battle of the Coral Sea passed in a blur of debriefings, repairs, and reassignments that would reshape the trajectory of the Pacific War. Veitasa found himself in Pearl Harbor, sitting across from a panel of senior officers who struggled to comprehend how a single dive bomber pilot had achieved what their fighter squadrons had been unable to accomplish for months. The interrogation room smelled of cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink as intelligence officers pressed him for every tactical detail of his engagement with the Japanese fighters. Captain Miles Browning, Admiral Halsey's chief of staff, leaned forward across the metal table and asked the question that would define Veitasa's future. "Lieutenant, do you believe other dive bomber pilots could replicate your tactics against enemy fighters?" The room fell silent as 3 admirals and a dozen staff officers waited for an answer that might revolutionize American naval aviation doctrine. Veitasa considered his response carefully, knowing that his words could influence training programs and tactical development across the entire Pacific Fleet. His answer was characteristically direct. "Sir, any pilot who understands his aircraft's capabilities and isn't afraid to use them aggressively can fight fighters and win. The SBD is tougher than the Zero, and our 50 caliber guns hit harder than their 20 millimeters. The problem isn't our equipment, it's our thinking." The statement sent ripples through the assembled officers, many of whom had spent their careers believing that bombers were inherently vulnerable to fighters and should avoid combat whenever possible. Within 48 hours, orders arrived transferring Vejtasa from Scouting Squadron 5 to Fighting Squadron 10 aboard the carrier Enterprise. The reassignment represented an unprecedented recognition that dive bomber experience could translate into fighter excellence, contradicting decades of naval aviation orthodoxy that treated different aircraft types as completely separate specialties. Squadron commanders had argued for years that bomber pilots lacked the aggressive instincts necessary for air-to-air combat, but Vejtasa's Coral Sea performance had shattered that assumption permanently. The transition to the Grumman F4F Wildcat proved surprisingly smooth for a pilot accustomed to the heavier, less agile Dauntless. The Wildcat was faster and more maneuverable than the SBD, but it shared many of the same design philosophies: rugged construction, heavy armament, and the ability to absorb significant battle damage while remaining flyable. Most importantly, the fighter carried 6 50 caliber machine guns compared to the dive bomber's 2, giving Vejtasa 3 times the firepower he had used to destroy 6 Japanese fighters over the Coral Sea. Training with VF-10 revealed the depth of tactical innovation that Vejtasa had developed during his bomber career. While other fighter pilots focused on traditional dogfighting maneuvers designed to exploit superior speed and climb rate, he emphasized defensive tactics that could neutralize enemy advantages through patience and precision. His approach was methodical rather than flashy. He studied Japanese fighter tactics obsessively, identifying weaknesses that aggressive American pilots could exploit. The opportunity to test these theories came sooner than expected. In late October 1942, Enterprise sailed south toward the Solomon Islands as part of a task force designed to intercept Japanese reinforcements heading for Guadalcanal. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy carriers were operating in the area, setting up another major confrontation between American and Japanese naval aviation. This time, Vejtasa would meet the enemy not as a dive bomber pilot fighting against overwhelming odds, but as a trained fighter pilot with the most advanced tactics in the Pacific Fleet. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands began before dawn on October 26th, when search planes from both sides made contact and began shadowing each other's task forces. The tactical situation developed along familiar lines. Japanese and American strike groups launched simultaneously, each racing to attack the other's carriers before their own ships came under assault. But this engagement would be different from Coral Sea because American fighter pilots now understood that aggressive tactics could overcome technical disadvantages. Vejtasa's section was assigned to escort duty, protecting American dive bombers and torpedo planes during their approach to the Japanese carriers. The mission should have been routine: maintain formation, ward off enemy fighters, and ensure that the strike aircraft reached their targets. But when 20 Japanese Zeros appeared on the horizon, diving toward the American formation with textbook precision, Vejtasa made the same decision he had made over the Coral Sea 5 months earlier. Instead of defensive maneuvering, he attacked. The engagement that followed would establish him as one of the most effective fighter pilots in American naval history. Using tactics developed during his dive bomber career, Vejtasa systematically destroyed 7 Japanese fighters in a single mission, earning the rare distinction of becoming an ace in a day. Each kill demonstrated a different aspect of the aggressive philosophy he had pioneered: patient defensive flying that drew enemy pilots into disadvantageous positions, followed by devastating bursts of concentrated 50 caliber fire. The first Zero fell to a head-on attack that exploited the Japanese pilot's expectation that American fighters would turn away from such encounters. The second died in a climbing spiral that favored the Wildcat's superior structural strength over the Zero's agility. The third, fourth, and fifth victories came during a running battle that lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Vejtasa using energy management and ammunition conservation to systematically eliminate each target. The final 2 kills occurred during the withdrawal, when Japanese pilots attempting to pursue the retiring American strike found themselves facing a fighter pilot who refused to be intimidated by superior numbers. News of Vejtasa's achievements spread through the Pacific Fleet within hours, carried by radio operators who had monitored the running commentary from his wingman. 7 confirmed kills in a single mission represented the kind of individual performance that could shift the momentum of entire campaigns. More importantly, his success validated the tactical revolution he had begun over the Coral Sea, proving that American pilots could not only compete with their Japanese counterparts, but dominate them when properly trained and equipped. The psychological impact of his victories extended far beyond their immediate tactical significance. Japanese naval aviation had built its reputation on the assumption of individual superiority, with each pilot trained to believe he was inherently better than any American opponent. But Veitasa's combined record of 9 confirmed kills in 2 major engagements suggested that American training and equipment had reached a level where individual Japanese advantages were no longer decisive. The war would continue for nearly 3 more years, with thousands of aerial engagements fought across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. But the tactical principles established by one dive bomber pilot, who refused to accept conventional wisdom about his aircraft's limitations, would influence every subsequent air battle. The lesson was clear and uncompromising. Superior equipment meant nothing without the aggressive spirit to use it effectively, and any pilot willing to think beyond traditional doctrine could achieve results that seemed impossible according to established theory. Decades later, military historians would identify Veitasa's Coral Sea engagement as the moment when American naval aviation discovered its true potential, proving that individual initiative and tactical innovation could overcome any technical disadvantage. One pilot's decision to turn and fight had changed the fundamental nature of aerial warfare in the Pacific.